Welcome back to another episode of Asheville Real Estate News during our election week, or maybe 2 weeks of coverage that we are going to be giving here on Asheville Real Estate News. Today, or on this episode, sat down with Nicole Townsend, who's running for Asheville City Council. Really good conversation, kind of went all over the place. Nicole has a lot of experience in different nonprofit organizations and community organizing. And so it was really interesting to just hear her story, how she decided to run, and what her platform is. So tune in, and don't forget to like, share, subscribe, pass the word on that this is happening here at Asheville Real Estate News. Thanks. We're good. All right. Are you good?
I'm good.
Awesome. Go about like 30 minutes or so.
Okay.
Give or take, depending how it feels. So we're good? Mm-hmm. Okay. Welcome back, everybody. Sitting here with Nicole. Welcome to the show, by the way. Really excited for this conversation.
Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, absolutely. Before we get started on everything else about, running and your campaign and whatnot, do you mind giving everybody the opportunity to kind of know a little bit about who you are and how Asheville became home?
Yeah, well, hi, y'all. My name is Nicole Townsend. I'm running for Asheville City Council. I am not an Asheville native. I was born and raised in New Madrid, Missouri. My grandparents fled rural Mississippi during the 40s. If you know any history about Mississippi, being black people in the 40s in Mississippi was not safe. And so my grandparents fled to southeast Missouri, and I lived there until I was about 12 or 13 and ended up moving to Asheville, where my mom was living. And so I have been in Asheville for quite some time now. Attended public school here. Have been organizing in this community around cash bail, around LGBTQ issues, and police accountability.
Yeah, I'm really excited to dive in a little bit on your history as far as your volunteer work and just some of the other work that you've done. I was reading on your website, great website, by the way, you've had like a lot of different experiences leading up to this. I was wondering if you could maybe start with what your first experience was as far as either involvement or volunteering that was kind of at the community grassroots level. First, and then I'd like to know what you think has been the one that's had the biggest ripple effects in your own personal life, if that's a clear question.
Yeah, it is. So when I was 20, there was a string of hate crimes happening in Asheville against members of the LGBTQ community, and I'm queer, and so I felt this deep sadness of well, why is this happening in this community that's extremely progressive? And so there was a collective of young, scrappy organizers that were just not in my community. And so for a couple years was just a part of a lot of local grassroots work involving the LGBTQ community, specifically around work happening on college campuses and how to create space for one another in community. A lot of, underground spoken word nights. So just building space with people. And I also realized that so many of my friends were not in this space.
And what space is that?
In white LGBTQ spaces.
Okay.
And so I started to question, well, why am I the only black person here, or why are there only 2 or 3 of us and we always know each other? And so I set out to ask people who live in Asheville, what is it like to be a person of color living in Asheville? So I created a film called Color Me Brown, Conversations with Unmuted Voices. And I literally had a $100 Best Buy camera and was walking up to people and was like, hey, I'm doing this thing. Can I put you on camera? And they were like, sure. And so began just ripping the Band-Aid off and learning a lot of history in Asheville, specifically Black history. I learned so much about the block. My stepdad is an Asheville native, and he actually went to elementary school where in the building that is now the Arthur Eddington Center. And so I was able to just really dig up so much stuff that if you weren't digging, you probably wouldn't find, and started realizing that Asheville was not as progressive as we claim it is. And that kind of led to this snowball effect of me doing work within nonprofits and outside of nonprofits, and really just trying to do the digging of like, why are people living in despair in a community that is progressive and has music every weekend, and we seem like we have it together, but our people are hurting.
Yeah. What made you keep going, do you think? Like, because sometimes, you know, as humans, we dig, we find something inside of ourselves or just in general, and you're like, whoa, okay, that was a little painful, or that was a little uncomfortable, I'm not going to go back there. But it seems like you found something that was both, and you kind of pressed into it and kept going, tried to keep uncovering. What do you remember, like, having thoughts around that? And, like, was that an intentional decision, or was it just kind of a byproduct of just going and going?
My family is my family is the major reason as to why I keep going. I think it's very easy to lose hope, especially when we're thinking of systems change and policy. I come from a family that was doing electoral work in rural Mississippi, and so in the 40s and 50s, and to come from a family that knew that they were going to get turned around and be told no, but to continue to do that work, I was like, certainly I can go toe-to-toe with progressives like, who are not a physical threat to me. And also there's just like a deep sense of hope, and I feel like if I didn't have the hope, then I couldn't do it. Like, I actually believe that we can create the Asheville that everyone deserves.
Right. Well, what do you know, kind of going back to the first question there, what do you think's been the organization or the volunteer group that you've been part of, or whatnot, that you think has had the biggest or the most long-standing, like, ripple effects for you?
Yeah, so I currently work for an organization called Southerners on New Ground, and
that's SONG, right?
Yeah, SONG.
Which is that your political party that you affiliate with? Did I catch that correctly? Or
yeah, so SONG is a nonprofit, and it's my political home. So the way we reference the organization is we are a political home operating under a nonprofit structure.
Gotcha.
And I became a member of SONG in 2017. SONG is a membership-based organization, and I also applied for a job with SONG that year and started working with them full-time in 2018. And I would say the organization, because it is membership-based, gets to be led by the people on the ground. And I've transformed so much since being a member first in the organization, because you can't do this work and not transform as a human being. And when I say transform, I mean deepen my political analysis, and start realizing that we can do all the work on the ground, but we also need to put our people in positions to change policy and legislation so that our work isn't just us always being on the defense, and we can, you know, get some offensive shots once in a while.
There's a lot of moving pieces to anything like that. And a question on that is, a lot of, I think, because I've never run for political office or anything like that, so definitely not the expert over here, but feels like a lot of the things that anybody who's running is going to be contingent on people showing up and supporting these initiatives. What's your outlook on that? Like, if when you get elected, do you feel like you're going to have consistent community backing for a lot of the platforms that you're running on?
Yeah, I mean, if I get elected, I also have to be clear that I cannot make any decision without community. And I'm committed to holding that promise, even if that means that I literally can't come to a vote. When you look at the hierarchy of local government here in Asheville, it says community members and then city council. And right now we're operating as if that's flipped.
So, question on that, because I hadn't heard that. So this is not like an educated question per se. It's just, but do you think that's just because there hasn't been an option up until recently as far as people being vested in showing up, or has it been because there's been like an intention to get there? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think that it's easier to make decisions when people aren't pushing you.
Right.
And we have a lot of barriers when it comes to community engagement and local government. I think of interpretation. I think of childcare. I think of public transportation. And we're continuing to make decisions that impact the people who have the most barriers to participating without allowing them to be in the room. I think we do a good job by allowing our city council meetings to be live streamed, but we don't allow people to make public comment if they're not physically in the room, and so people in community have always been active and have always been building within their communities outside of the system, because the system has not shown that it has cared. And quite frankly, sometimes we have to question, was it even created to care? Which is very interesting for someone who's running for office to say. But I think that people are having these hard community conversations, and people are also very tired, because when people do show up, they're often shut down. And so it's like, well, if I'm shut down or the way that I talk isn't, quote unquote, good enough, why am I going to continue to show up when I can go just put all my energy in my community?
Yeah, it's an interesting decision that I guess people have to make and play that out. There's so much to go here, but let's go back to what are you running on? Like, what are your platforms? Like, I've read them, but I would love to hear kind of a little bit, because you have 3 pillars essentially, right? Unless I missed something.
Yeah. So when I was making the decision to run, I really had to stop and think, what are the things that are impacting my community in this time, at this moment? And that's public safety, education equity, and environmental justice, which I believe the 3 of those are intersectional and are operating together. A lot of times when people say public safety, well, tell me, when I say public safety, what you think about.
When I hear the words public safety, I initially go to thinking about the ability to be comfortable and not overthink being in or around the city or wherever my house or home is at, or work.
Yeah. And so when I'm talking to people and I'm like, well, what makes you safe in your community? And they're like, well, roads that don't always have potholes, sidewalks, access to bus stops that I don't have to walk a mile or 2 miles to get to. And so I'm like, how do we make neighborhoods safe for everybody? And that means, how do we make neighborhoods again that have grocery stores, that have crosswalks, that have parks? So thinking of like, what does that look like when all of our neighborhoods are actually equitable, where neighborhoods that don't just have wealth have the nicer parks or have the nicer basketball courts? Because when I'm talking to our youth, they're like, well, I really wish that we had a basketball court, or that we had a sidewalk so we could safely walk to the basketball court.
Right.
And then when I think of education equity, I went to public school here in Asheville, and my experience is valid. And when I sit down with our teachers, they're like, Nicole, I have to go work at the McDonald's or the Target when I get off. I can't do my job.
Right.
I can't truly invest in my students if I'm struggling to pay my bills. And then when I talk to kids, they're like, I also have a part-time job and am getting home at 12 or 1. And talking to the parents who are like, me too. And so when I think about education equity, I'm like, what do we need to do in our classrooms so that our teachers and our students can both show up the way that they really want to show up? How do we need to support our parents when they need to be going to parent-teacher conferences? Who do we need to step in and intervene when our parents have to be at work? And so how do we think of education equity in a holistic way? And then I'm very upset with the way we're handling the situation with the opportunity gap, because in 2012, Dr. Mullen and his students at UNC Asheville presented us with the State of Black Asheville, and it said, hey, y'all, here's our disparities when it comes to Black folks in Asheville. And now in 2017, 2018, we're all like, well, y'all, we need to pay consultants to do a disparity study, and now we need to talk about this opportunity gap. And I'm like, we have a whole institution in our community with students and a professor who lives here who did this for us, and we're not listening to them.
Yeah, like most places, there's always a lot of work to do.
Mm-hmm.
When it comes to education and public safety, curious to know, and I guess maybe this could be a component of environmental justice, and I'll let you make that decision when you answer the question is, so primarily we talk real estate here, and you know, we're deviating from that a little bit. This whole week, we're just trying to talk to as many people who are running for office as possible to, well, hopefully in theory, give everybody the opportunity to know so that they can make a decision. What's your view, even though it might not be your main focus, on the housing situation when it comes to either buying, renting, et cetera, living here? And how does that play into, you know, public safety and education, if at all?
It does. We are in a housing crisis, and I think we need to stop pretending we're not. Mm-hmm. I actually talked to a mother today who got a housing voucher, wanted to stay in Asheville. She was like, these were her words. They waved the golden ticket in front of me and said, now you can get out. She was living in public housing. And she's like, wow, like maybe I can get like an actual like home with a little bit of yard space for my kids. Couldn't find a place in Asheville. It is extremely hard for someone with a housing voucher to rent a home in Asheville. And so now she is living further out in the county, had to take her kids out of the school that they loved. And now she's experiencing a situation where her kid is the only black kid. And so now this kid is deeply struggling with what it means to be a black kid in an all-white institution and not have black teachers or other black friends to like lean on. And so
kind of double-edged sword.
Yeah, I like deeply just sit with like, well, what does that education equity look like for that kid? Yeah. What's that experience going to be? Should this mama not have the opportunity to come back within city limits? And I want to figure out how we can support local folks who have homes for rent with incentives so that they can actually be more open to taking our vouchers, because I don't want someone who gets the opportunity to utilize a voucher to have to like leave the city limits if they don't want to and leave the school structure that their kid is used to.
Yeah, it should be, what you'd hope is that a voucher is going to be something that's going to be an exciting new change, not necessarily a painful transition, I suppose, which is, it sounds like that's what that family's experiencing.
Yeah.
Yeah, housing. We had an episode, I don't even remember how many, it might have been a year and a half ago, with Open Doors. I'm not sure if you're familiar with Jen, and we talked about how housing is such a big important, like if you don't have a place to go home and do work or homework, et cetera, things like that to feel safe, and then it's really hard to do anything that's going to contribute to the school if the only place you do is at school. So it's a tough piece of the puzzle. But let's go back to the environmental justice. Haven't touched on it too much, so talk to me. What does that look like? Why is it important to you, and what are the steps to move that forward for you?
Yeah, so before moving to Asheville, I lived in a town with 2,500 people. I come from a place in Missouri where agriculture is big. I mean, people were fleeing to Missouri in the 20s, 30s, and 40s because the land was so good to work on. And now I go back home, and most of that land has been bought by Monsanto. And so that was a moment for me where I was just like, this doesn't feel right. And then also being in high school here in Asheville and Katrina happening and having people from Louisiana now be my classmates, and they're like, I'm here because of the storm. And so these factors of what it means when corporations like buy our land from us and poison people, and what happens when people have to flee where they live because of climate migration. I've worked with organizations like Green Opportunities and Asheville Green Works, specifically of how do we, expand the definition of what an environmentalist is. I've also done work with Dogwood Alliance, and through that have been able to support my community with like putting the data behind what we feel and see every day, putting the data behind the stories, because sometimes the stories people don't want to hear, but when you give them that pie chart, they're like, okay, I guess I'll listen to you. When I think of environmental justice, I think about the cars on the road. And if we actually want to lessen the amount of cars on the road and the amount of people who are not biking and walking, we need to address food deserts. People are leaving their communities to take 4-hour bus trips just to go to the grocery store. And then you go to Merriman Avenue and you have, 6 or 7 grocery stores? And so when I think of equity and public safety and environmental justice all going hand in hand, yes, we need to reduce our carbon footprint, and we need to be putting grocery stores in communities.
Yeah, that's the food desert. So that's come up on the show before, and it's always been a question typically of zoning and how do you get that to work, because like if you use like West Asheville as an example, right? Because that's where we're at. Like, where's the closest grocery store? There isn't one really that's close by walking / biking bus standards. I guess the closest one would be down by the DMV on Patton, now that Earth Fair closed, right?
And then the Ingalls on Haywood Road.
Oh, yeah.
And
I keep forgetting about that one. So never mind. So I guess that point's a little
Westville Market.
Oh,
yeah.
well.
So there's a couple. We're near a few.
So never mind. All of this. Don't pay attention to my geography. I feel so. No, but where do you put one that's not there then? Because it's probably there's a food desert because there's probably not been the opportunity to build a grocery store there. It's an assumption I'm making. I don't know if that's accurate as far as like how do you get around people saying like, hey, look, we're going to put a grocery store right next to your house. It used to be residentially zoned, but now we're going to change the zoning. Is that the conversation that you're looking to have, or how does that play itself out?
So for instance, let's look at South Side, and just for clarity, it's not South Slope, it's South Side. South
Can you expand on that? Because I've been calling it South Slope.
South Slope is like post-gentrification. Okay. And South Side is pre-gentrification. And so when you're in South Side, near Livingston and Erskine and Walton, there is, a slate of eateries near the Soapy Dog area. And then there's also Green's Mini Mart. Like, those are areas in which a few years ago there were organizations thinking about putting a grocery store. It was already, the structure was there. There's a lot of, that's a whole nother 7-hour conversation. But I think about the opportunity that there was to actually put a grocery store on the South Side. And also we have to stop thinking of grocery stores as like the big box stores that so many of us have gotten used to because of, being in cities. I'm thinking of community-owned co-ops that are smaller but have some of the essentials, your fruits, vegetables, diapers, milk, a hot bar. Right. So nothing the size of,
Okay, because I'm thinking
a department store. No, I'm thinking usually community co-ops and markets are smaller, but they tend to have what the community wants. You don't have 30 options of cereal. The community is mostly going to eat 3 options, so those are your 3 options. Gotcha. Yeah.
What are you the most excited to tackle when you get elected? What would be number one thing that you would start working on?
That's a great question. Two of the immediate things that I really want to work on. One, I want to work with our city manager so that we can expand on this written consent to search policy that was put in place last year. I want to expand on it so that our pedestrians and bicyclists are included, and it's not just for people who are driving. Because I'm if we want to meet our environmental justice goals, that means we want more people walking and riding their bike. We need to make sure that if people make the decision to walk and ride their bike, they are protected the same way they would be protected if they were driving a car. Yeah. And I also want to work with Buncombe County to sign a resolution that supports the demands that our local educators, really educators across North Carolina, have put up to the state legislator. I know a resolution is not action, but it at least acknowledges as a county and as a city that we stand behind our teachers, and we're going to fight with them on a state level.
Yeah, those would be two big action items. Good luck as you roll them out. I forgot to ask this at the beginning, so I'm going to jump back. When and why did you decide to run to begin with?
That's a great question. As an organizer, I'm very honest about the fact that I sit with the contradictions of what it means to have an inside and an outside game. Mm-hmm. For so long, my people have played defense. Mm-hmm. And like I said earlier, I want to get some buckets up. I want to be on the offense. And so that means that I need to be in one of those seats. Mm-hmm. Doesn't mean I'm going to solve everything, but it means I'm going to be a voice there, champion for the people. I decided to run when Shanika Smith won. Mm-hmm. I remember before the general, I looked at her and I said, if you win, I'm next. Mm-hmm. And she won. And I keep my commitments. This is also a deep commitment to my community. Every day, I see our people working so hard in a system that isn't necessarily working with them. And I see the fruit that comes out of that. And I'm like, we could have so much more bounty if we actually had a local government that was like, okay, let's just cut the woo-woo. Mm-hmm. Let's stop apologizing for gentrification and urban renewal and actually create an action plan for communities that are the action piece that need to come with an apology. Mm-hmm.
You mentioned gentrification a couple of times.
Yeah.
And, well, we're in the real estate.
Yeah.
And so I guess it's a tough thing to know how to address, or I'm not even sure how to question what the question would be, but how do you balance protecting neighborhoods with people's desire and ability to sell if they feel like that's the right thing for them? Because that, at least in my experience, that's what I've lived and that's what I've seen, is it's not that anybody's getting forced to do anything from like, well, you're the last house on the block. It's more of, hey, like transitions here for XYZ. Sometimes it's things that could be avoided. Other times they're just moving. But it starts a ripple effect. So how do you balance that? Or how do you handle that? Or what's the conversation? Maybe might be the better question.
Yeah. So in 2012, my dad sold our family home. Mm-hmm. He could not afford the upkeep of the home. Mm-hmm. There are people in our community who sell their homes because they can't afford the upkeep.
Right.
And so it's not about, I want to go move to a different part of the community. It's about, like, I literally just can't afford the upkeep. Yeah. And so I'm like, how do we make sure that affordable housing isn't just about renters, but is about people who may own their home or maybe in the process of owning their home? Mm-hmm. And we also have to, talk about the hard fact that so many people cannot afford to buy a home in the neighborhood they grew up in. Mm-hmm. So many Black folks in Asheville grew up in Montfort, but will never be able to afford to buy a house there. And so when we talk about gentrification, it's not just about who sells their home, because yes, anyone has the right to sell their home to whoever they want to sell it to. But so many people are longing to be back in the neighborhoods that they once called home and are like, a $600,000 price tag is a little too much for me. Mm-hmm. And so I think we need to talk about what it means for when people move into neighborhoods. What is the responsibility for someone to really understand the culture of a neighborhood and actually get to know their neighbors, so they're not just like, there's some random person who just keeps walking down my street at 2 a.m. and I'm just going to call the police. Mm-hmm. When you can ask your neighbor, well, who is that random person that is always walking down singing that song? And they're like, oh, that's Tom. He's lived here for 50 years. So it's like a combination of why can't people afford to live in the neighborhoods they grew up in? Why have prices skyrocketed that much? And what is the community accountability to actually building community with one another, so that we're making sure we're not harming the community that was already there before we moved into the neighborhood?
Yeah, I think you made some really good points there, and definitely would be a lot more to unpack there. I guess my question, though, just off of that isn't it potentially a slippery slope to have a city governing body to get into regulating some of those things versus, an educational thing of like being like, hey, like, I don't know, understand where you're moving. Here are like 5 things to do when you buy a house to like get to know, like what's that balance before the city's like imposing almost like HOA rules across neighborhoods, right? Because I don't think that would be the positive effect that anybody's looking for either.
No, so it's the both and. I think it's the responsibility of us to like lift up the culture and the history of neighborhoods. And for the city, one thing that the city can do is invest in community land trust. Yeah. And so by investing in community land trust, we're allowing the land and the property to be a communal property. And so that's kind of how I see the city operating, not imposing the rules, but we can have an obligation of lifting up the culture. For instance, when people talk about Montfort, they don't often talk about Stumptown. That was a historic neighborhood that's no longer there. And so I'm like, let's lift up this history across the city, not just like city officials, but like the chamber. And when people come to our city, how do we like really make sure we're telling them the true history? I think of organizations like Hood Huggers that allows people to go on tours. So people are like, oh, this is the history of Asheville that wasn't in my brochure.
Gotcha. No, that makes sense. Thanks for clarifying. Yeah. Well, as we're wrapping up here, is there anything I haven't asked you about or anything we didn't touch on that you really want to just take a couple moments and talk about or share because you really believe in it?
Somewhat, yeah. One thing I will say, I want to be clear to anyone who votes that it's not enough to just vote for one person that you love or you like or who's your neighbor. We have to also understand that in order to get anything passed on council, there has to be a 4-vote majority. And so when I think about who I'm voting for and the people that I'm like 100% I want them on council, I'm also like, well, who are the people that are going to work with the person that I really like? Because those are also the people I need to vote in. And so, like I said, there's a 4-vote majority on council. Our favorite person can't get everything done alone. If someone tells you they can, then they are selling you hopes and dreams. So we need to be voting also for people who are going to work with that person that we just are 100% champion. Not so that they can, be clones and agree 100% of the time, but so they can be willing to struggle with one another in a way that allows them to come to some kind of solution.
Yeah, I'm really glad you mentioned that. I think I knew that, forgotten that, and so it's a good reminder. I'm sure a lot of people will appreciate the same. Well, if somebody listened to this and they're like, man, Nicole really resonated with me, how do they get in contact with you? How do they show up to support you and just be part of your campaign?
Yeah, so if you have Facebook, you can find me on Facebook, Nicole Townsend for Asheville. You can also email me, info@townsendforavl.com. I also have a website, Townsend for Avil, for FOR, not the number, townsendforavil.com. I'm definitely interested in sitting down and having coffee with people. I want to be able to dive deeper into these questions with people in community.
Yeah, well, thanks for taking the time to dive into these today.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me.
Really appreciated it. Yeah. So there you guys go. If you enjoyed this conversation, make sure you share with anybody who's thinking about or trying to still make decisions on who to vote for. Remember, this whole week we are airing, maybe it might be 2 weeks, depending how it pans out. We still don't know what the release schedule is, but just tune in. If you have questions or you want to know more about any of the candidates, come back here. You can find out all the information as well online at avlrealestatenews.com. Nicole, thank you so much for joining us, and see you guys all next week.
Thank you.